They thought the story ended when the wedding stopped, when the billionaire walked away from the altar, when the bride stood frozen in silence, when the maid's voice faded into the crowd. But that was only the beginning. In part 1, you witnessed how a single sentence spoken by the poorest woman in the room shattered a billionaire's perfect life and exposed a secret buried for decades, a secret powerful enough to stop a wedding and dangerous enough to wake enemies that were never meant to be remembered. What you didn't see was what that truth would cost. Because when Richard Hale chose to listen to the past instead of running from it, he didn't just uncover his father's story. He reopened a deal that was never meant to be broken, a deal that protected lives and destroyed others. If you haven't watched part 1, stop here and go back now, because nothing in this chapter will make sense without the truth that was revealed at that altar. And if you did watch it, stay with me. Because in part 2, we're uncovering what happens after the truth comes out, when power fights back, silence becomes dangerous, and the smallest voice in the room realizes she may have said too much. This is where the real story begins. They say the truth will set you free, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes freedom comes with a price so steep you'll wish you had stayed silent. What happens when one moment of courage unravels decades of carefully constructed lies? When a single voice shatters an empire built on secrets? This is what happened when Clara Bennett spoke up at that wedding, and what followed changed everything. When Richard Cole walked away from his wedding altar that afternoon, the cameras eventually stopped flashing, the guests went home whispering, and the news cycle moved on to the next scandal. To everyone watching, it looked like just another billionaire having cold feet, another rich man who couldn't commit. But for Richard, that walk down the aisle and out the door wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something he had been running from his entire life. The truth Clara had spoken didn't just expose his father's past. It opened a door Richard had spent 30 years keeping locked. And once that door opened, there was no closing it again. The morning after the wedding that never happened, Richard stood in his penthouse overlooking the city skyline. The sun was rising over buildings he owned, over streets where his name appeared on monuments and charity foundations. But in that moment, Richard Cole felt smaller than he ever had in his life. His tuxedo lay crumpled on the bedroom floor like a discarded identity. His phone had been buzzing non-stop since yesterday. Lawyers, investors, publicists, all wanting answers he didn't have. Margaret's mother had left 6 voicemails, each one more controlled and threatening than the last. Richard ignored them all. Instead, he picked up his phone and scrolled to a number he had saved just hours earlier. His father's number, Daniel Cole, the man he had hated for 30 years, the man who had abandoned him when he was just 8 years old. Richard stared at the number for a long time before finally pressing call. It rang 4 times, and with each ring, Richard felt his heart pound harder. Then a cautious voice answered. Richard? His father sounded afraid, like he thought the call might be a mistake, like his son might hang up any second. Richard took a deep breath. "I want to understand everything," he said quietly. "Not pieces, not your excuses. Everything." There was a long pause on the other end, and Richard could hear his father breathing, could almost feel the weight of 30 years pressing through the phone line. Then Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "Come sit with me. There are things you need to hear that won't survive a phone call, things I should have told you a long time ago." 2 hours later, Richard found himself standing outside an apartment building in a part of town he rarely visited. It wasn't dangerous, just modest, the kind of place where normal people lived normal lives. His father's apartment was on the 3rd floor, no elevator. Richard climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When Daniel opened the door, Richard barely recognized him. The The man standing there looked older than Richard remembered, worn down by time and regret. But there was something else in his eyes now, something Richard had never seen before. Relief, maybe, or hope. The apartment was small but clean, no expensive artwork on the walls, no designer furniture, just books stacked on shelves, old photographs in simple frames, and the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to live with very little. They sat at a small kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee between them, and for the first time in 30 years, Daniel Cole began to tell his son the truth. He started with his addiction. It didn't happen overnight, Daniel said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup like he needed something to hold on to. It started small, a drink after work to take the edge off, then 2 drinks. Then I needed it to function. I told myself I could stop any time. That's what addicts always say, isn't it? I can stop whenever I want, but I couldn't. Richard listened without interrupting, though every word felt like a knife. The gambling came next, Daniel continued, his voice dropping lower. I thought I could win back what I was losing. Stupid, I know, but addiction makes you stupid, makes you believe impossible things. The debts piled up faster than I could count them, and then the people I owed money to, they weren't the kind of people who forget. Daniel's hands started shaking, and Richard noticed for the first time how much his father had aged, how the weight of this secret had carved lines in his face. They didn't just threaten me, Richard, Daniel said, and now his eyes were filling with tears. They came to our house. They knew your school schedule. They knew what time you walked home every day. They knew which park you played in on weekends. Richard felt something cold and violent twist in his chest. His father continued, One night they came to me, 2 men in suits, very calm, very polite. They told me exactly how much I owed. Then they told me what would happen if I didn't pay. They said they would hurt you. They described in detail what they would do. And they said there was only one way out. Richard's voice came out as a whisper. What way? Daniel wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. They told me to disappear, to make it look like I abandoned my family, like I was just another deadbeat dad who couldn't handle responsibility. They said if I did that, if I left and never contacted you or your mother again, they would consider the debt paid. They would leave you alone. The room fell silent except for the traffic outside the window. So you let me hate you, Richard said, and it wasn't a question, it was an accusation wrapped in understanding. Daniel nodded slowly, tears now streaming down his face. I thought if you hated me, it would protect you. I thought if you believed I was just a coward who ran away, you would move on, build a better life, become everything I couldn't be. He looked at Richard with eyes full of 30 years of pain. All those years of anger, of building his empire to prove something to a father who wasn't even there to see it. All of it based on a lie, not the lie he thought, but a different kind of lie, a sacrifice disguised as betrayal. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But the story didn't end there. That night, as Richard sat in his father's modest apartment, Daniel revealed something else, something that made Richard's blood run cold. The people I owed money to, Daniel said carefully, they weren't just loan sharks or street criminals. They were connected, powerful, the kind of people who move money through legitimate businesses, who sit on charity boards and shake hands with politicians. Richard leaned forward. What are you saying? Daniel pulled out an old folder from a drawer, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside were photographs, newspaper clippings, names written in Daniel's careful handwriting. After I disappeared, I started watching, following trails. I needed to understand who had destroyed my life, who had taken my son from me. He spread the papers on the table. Some of these people, Richard, some of them are people you know, people you do business with right now. Richard looked at the names and felt the floor drop out from underneath him. Board members, investors, people he had trusted for years, people who had helped him build his empire.
Are you telling me, Richard said slowly, his mind racing, that the same organization that forced you to leave has been around me this whole time? Daniel nodded grimly. I think they've been watching you your whole life, making sure you became successful, making sure you stayed in line. You were always an investment to them, Richard. Your debt wasn't paid when you left. It transferred to you. They just changed how they collected. The implications crashed over Richard like a wave. Every major deal, every connection that seemed too good to be true, every door that opened just when he needed it, had any of it been real, or had he been a puppet dancing on strings he couldn't see? While Richard was uncovering the truth about his past, Clara Bennett was discovering the cost of her courage. She had gone back to work the day after the wedding, same uniform, same quiet efficiency, but everything had changed. People looked at her differently now, some with curiosity,
wondering what had possessed a catering worker to speak up at a billionaire's wedding. Others with barely concealed hostility, angry that she had disrupted an event they had worked months to prepare. Management hadn't spoken to her directly, but Clara felt the shift. Her schedule changed suddenly. Hours were cut without explanation. The best assignments went to other staff members. And then the notes started appearing in her locker. The first one was simple: mind your own business. Clara tried to ignore it, told herself it was just someone being petty, but the notes kept coming. Some truths get people hurt. You should have stayed silent. This isn't over. Clara didn't scare easily. She had grown up in neighborhoods where you learned to be tough or you didn't survive. But these notes felt different. They felt organized, deliberate. Then one afternoon during her lunch break, a man she had never seen before sat down across from her in the staff cafeteria. He was well-dressed, calm, with the kind of face that was impossible to remember. "Clara Bennett," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You have a talent for speaking at the wrong time." Clara's heart started pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't know who you are." The man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You don't need to know who I am. You just need to understand something. Richard Cole's father made a deal a long time ago, a deal that kept certain people safe. You disrupted that deal, and disruptions have consequences." He stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket. "Be careful, Clara. People who speak up about things they don't understand have a way of disappearing." Then he walked away, leaving Clara sitting alone with her half-eaten sandwich, her hands shaking. That same evening, Richard received a phone call from a blocked number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "You should have let the past stay buried," a distorted voice said on the other end. "Your father made a deal. You just broke it by talking to him. There will be consequences." The line went dead before Richard could respond. He immediately called Clara, something inside him knowing instinctively that if he was being threatened, she was in danger too. When she told him about the man in the cafeteria, Richard felt a surge of guilt so powerful it almost knocked him over. "I never meant for this to fall on you," he said when he met her at a coffee shop the next morning. Clara looked at him with those steady eyes that had seen through him at the wedding. "Your mother knew this might happen," she said quietly. Richard froze. "What do you mean?" Clara took a breath. "Before your mother passed away 6 months ago, she came to see me. She worked with my mother years ago. Did you know that? They were friends. She told me about your father, about what really happened, and she said one day you would need to know the truth." Richard felt like the ground was shifting under him. Why didn't she tell me herself? Clara's eyes were sad. "She tried, Richard, but you were too angry, too closed off. She knew you wouldn't hear it from her, so she asked me to watch for the right moment. Your wedding seemed like the last chance. She said if you were about to marry Margaret without knowing the truth about family, about sacrifice, about what love really means, then you would spend your whole life building the wrong things." Richard sat back, overwhelmed. His mother had planned this, had set this in motion before she died, had trusted a woman he didn't even know to deliver the truth he needed to hear.
She told me something else, Clara added softly. She said speaking the truth would wake something up, that there would be consequences. But she also said living a lie was worse than any consequence. She wanted you to be free, Richard, even if freedom was dangerous. Within 2 weeks, Richard's carefully constructed empire began to tremble. It started small. A major real estate deal that had been locked down for months suddenly collapsed overnight, the buyers pulling out with vague excuses about market conditions. Then, a regulatory board announced an unexpected audit of Richard's holdings, citing anonymous complaints. A board member who had been with Richard for 10 years resigned without explanation, refusing to take Richard's calls. Each problem on its own was manageable, the kind of setback any businessman faces, but together they formed a pattern. Someone was sending a message. Someone was reminding Richard that power had limits and that there were consequences for breaking old agreements, even agreements he had never made himself. Richard worked 18-hour days trying to contain the damage, but it felt like fighting shadows. Every time he solved a problem, 2 more appeared. His lawyers were baffled, his team was exhausted, and Richard knew exactly what was happening. The organization his father had warned him about was tightening its grip, showing him what they could do if he continued to dig into the past. Meanwhile, Clara's situation got worse. Her hours were cut to almost nothing. She was reassigned to the worst shifts, the ones nobody wanted. Anonymous complaints were filed against her performance, things that had never been issues before, and the notes in her locker continued, each one more threatening than the last. Stop talking to Richard Cole. This is your last warning. Some people don't get second chances. Clara was scared, but she was also angry. She had spoken the truth, she had done the right thing, and now she was being punished for it. When Richard came to see her again, offering to help, offering money to relocate or security or whatever she needed, Clara surprised him by refusing. "If I run," she said firmly, "then they win. Then the truth gets buried again. Is that what your mother wanted? Is that what you want?" Richard didn't know how to answer that. He was used to fixing problems with money, with power, with influence, but this was different. This was about principle, about standing up even when it cost you everything. Margaret Lowell reappeared in Richard's life on a Tuesday afternoon. She walked into his office unannounced, moving past his assistant with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting whatever she wanted. She looked as elegant as ever, designer suit, perfect hair, but there was something harder in her eyes now, something cold. "Clara," Richard said, standing up from his desk, "I didn't expect to see you." "I sure you didn't," she replied, her voice controlled. "You destroyed my future, Richard. My reputation, my family's business connections, all of it gone in one afternoon because you couldn't go through with what we had planned." Richard felt the guilt, but also something else. Clarity. "I'm sorry for how it happened," he said honestly, "but I couldn't marry you, Margaret, not after learning the truth. It wouldn't have been fair to either of us." Margaret laughed, but it was bitter. "Fair, Richard. Life isn't fair. Life is about strategy, about alliances, about building something bigger than yourself. We could have had that." She walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "But you chose to chase ghosts instead, chose to listen to a catering worker over everything we had built together." There was pain in her voice now, underneath the anger. "I did care about you, you know, in my own way." Richard moved closer. "I know you did, and I cared about you too, but it wasn't love, Margaret, not the kind that builds a real life. It was comfortable, convenient, but not real." Margaret turned to face him, and for a moment her mask slipped. Maybe real isn't what matters. Maybe surviving matters. Maybe protecting what you have matters. Then her expression changed, and Richard saw something that made his blood run cold. Fear. "Richard, be careful," she said, quietly, urgently. "There are things you don't understand, people you don't know about." "What do you mean?" Richard asked, stepping closer. Margaret hesitated, and in that hesitation, Richard understood. "You knew," he said slowly. "You knew about the organization, about my father, about all of it." Margaret's silence was confirmation. "How long?" Richard demanded. "How long have you known?" Margaret looked away. "My family has done business with certain people for generations, Richard. We don't ask questions. We don't dig into the past. We survived by staying in line and playing the game." She met his eyes again. "I thought you understood that. I thought you were like me. But you're not. You're like your mother. You want truth more than you want safety." She moved toward the door, then paused. "They won't let you expose them, Richard. They have too much to lose. And people who threaten to expose them don't just lose their businesses. They disappear. They have accidents. Their families suffer." "Is that a threat?" Richard asked. Margaret shook her head sadly. "It's a warning from someone who actually did care about you, even if you don't believe it." Then she left, her heels clicking on the marble floor, leaving Richard alone with the weight of what she had just revealed. 3 days after Margaret's visit, Richard got the call he had been dreading. His father had collapsed. The hospital said it was stress-related, exhaustion, nothing immediately life-threatening. But when Richard rushed to his father's bedside, he knew it was more than that. Daniel looked smaller in the hospital bed, older, like the years of carrying secrets had finally caught up with him. Tubes and monitors surrounded him, beeping steadily. When he saw Richard, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, "for all of it, for leaving, for the secrets, for dragging you into this." Richard took his father's hand, surprised by how natural it felt. "Don't apologize now, just rest. We'll figure this out."
But Daniel shook his head weakly. "There's something else. Something I haven't told you yet." Richard's stomach dropped. "What is it?" Daniel's grip tightened on Richard's hand. "The deal I made when I left. It wasn't just about disappearing. They made me sign something. Documents, information about clients, accounts, business dealings, things I had access to before the addiction took over everything." Richard felt the room closing in. "What kind of information?" Daniel's breathing was labored now. "Names, bank accounts, money laundering routes. I worked in finance before everything fell apart. Did you know that? I saw things, knew things, and when they came to collect, they didn't just want me gone. They wanted insurance. They wanted leverage." He coughed, and Richard helped him sip some water. "I thought it would never matter," Daniel continued. "I thought I had buried it so deep no one would ever find it. But some of those people, Richard, some of them are in your network now. They've been watching you for years, making sure you stayed useful, making sure you never dug too deep." Richard's mind raced through the implications. His entire career, every major connection, every door that had opened, had any of it been earned? Or had he been cultivated, shaped, guided by the same organization that had destroyed his father's life? "Where is this information now?" Richard asked urgently. Daniel looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Hidden. Safe. But if something happens to me, if I disappear or die suspiciously, it all goes public. That's the only thing that's kept me alive this long." That night, Richard sat in his apartment, unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except the impossible choice in front of him. He could protect his empire, keep his head down, play the game the way Margaret and her family had for generations. He had worked his whole life to build what he had. Every asset, every property, every connection represented years of sacrifice and strategy. Walking away from that felt like erasing himself. But he could also finish what Clara and his mother had started. He could expose the truth, bring down the organization that had controlled his family for 30 years. It would cost him everything, his wealth, his reputation, possibly his safety, and it would put everyone he cared about in danger. Clara, his father, anyone who had helped him. Richard thought about his mother's words, delivered through Clara. Living a lie was worse than any consequence. She had known what she was asking him to do, had known the price he would pay, but she had also known him well enough to understand that once he saw the truth, he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he looked away. The next morning, Richard called a meeting with his lawyers. Not the corporate lawyers, but a different kind. Investigators, journalists, people who specialized in exposing corruption, people who couldn't be bought. He also called Clara. "Are you sure about this?" she asked when she arrived at his apartment. "If you do this, there's no going back. You'll lose everything." Richard looked at her, this woman who had spoken up at his wedding, who had risked everything to tell him the truth, who had refused to run even when threatened.
"My mother knew what she was doing when she told you," Richard said. "She knew I would need someone who understood what it meant to sacrifice safety for truth, someone who had already done it." Clara smiled sadly. "Your mother was remarkable. I only knew her for a few months before she passed, but she made an impact. She talked about you constantly, about how much she loved you, about how proud she was, but also how worried. She said you were building an empire on sand, and one day the tide would come in." Richard felt tears threatening. "I wish I had listened to her when she was alive. I wish I hadn't been so angry, so closed off." Clara put a hand on his arm. "She knew you loved her, Richard. She knew. And she understood why you were angry. That's why she did this. She wanted to set you free before she left." Richard took a deep breath and made his decision. "Then let's finish what she started. Let's expose everything." Over the next 2 months, Richard worked with investigators to piece together the full scope of the organization his father had been entangled with. It was bigger than Richard had imagined, not just a local criminal network, but an international operation that had infiltrated legitimate businesses for decades. They laundered money through real estate, controlled politicians through carefully hidden donations, silenced whistleblowers through intimidation, and worse. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, testimony, documents his father had kept hidden for 30 years. And as the investigation progressed, more people came forward, other victims, other families destroyed by the same organization. When the story finally broke, it shattered boardrooms across the country. Front-page headlines, congressional hearings, criminal investigations. Dozens of prominent business leaders were implicated. Politicians resigned. Banks collapsed. Richard's name was everywhere, the billionaire who had sacrificed his empire to expose corruption. But the media narrative wasn't entirely sympathetic. Some outlets painted him as reckless, as someone who had destroyed legitimate businesses and cost thousands of people their jobs. Others questioned his motives, suggested he was settling personal scores. The public was divided, but the truth was out there now, and it couldn't be buried again. Richard lost almost everything he had spent his life building. Assets were frozen during investigations. Business partners cut ties. The Cole name, which had once opened every door, now made people turn away. He was forced to sell his penthouse, his cars, most of his possessions just to cover legal fees and support the investigation. But something unexpected happened too. Daniel recovered. The stress that had nearly killed him lifted when the secrets finally came out. He moved in with Richard, and for the first time since Richard was 8 years old, they lived under the same roof as father and son. They cooked meals together, talked late into the night, made up for 30 years of lost time. "I'm proud of you," Daniel said one evening, tears in his eyes. "I know I have no right to be. I know I lost that right when I left. But I'm proud of the man you've become. Not the billionaire, the man who chose truth over comfort." Richard hugged his father, and it felt like coming home. Clara was promoted at her catering company, not loudly, not with fanfare, but with the kind of security she had never known before. The company's ownership changed hands during the investigation, bought by people who valued integrity over connections. Her salary tripled. She was offered management positions. But more than that, she had dignity, respect, the knowledge that speaking up had mattered. Richard stood in a small office in a part of town he would never have visited before everything changed. The office was modest, nothing like the empire he used to command, but it was his. He had started a nonprofit, an organization that helped families affected by corruption and organized crime. He used the skills he'd learned building his business empire, the strategy, the connections that remained, the understanding of how systems worked, but now he used them for something that actually mattered. Daniel worked with him. So did Clara. They helped other people find the courage to speak up, provided legal support, protected whistleblowers. It didn't make them rich. Richard lived in a regular apartment now, took public transportation, learned to cook his own meals. But when he looked in the mirror, he recognized the person looking back. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Cole was free. One afternoon, Richard received a letter. It was from Margaret. She had moved to Europe after the scandal, started over in a place where the Cole name meant nothing. The letter was brief. "You were right," she wrote, "about truth mattering more than comfort, about love being more than strategy. I hated you for a long time for showing me that, but I think I understand now. I think I'm finally starting to build something real, something that's mine, not my family's legacy. Thank you for having the courage I didn't. Maybe one day I'll be brave enough to do what you did, but not yet, not yet." Richard folded the letter carefully and put it in his desk drawer. Some people need more time. Some people aren't ready for the cost of truth, and that's okay. Everyone's journey is different. That evening, Richard had dinner with his father and Clara. They ate at Daniel's apartment, nothing fancy, just pasta and salad and cheap wine. They laughed about small things, shared stories, made plans for the future that didn't involve billion-dollar deals or corporate empires. And as Richard sat there, listening to his father tell a joke that wasn't particularly funny, but made Clara laugh anyway, he realized something profound. He had spent 30 years building an empire to prove something to a father who wasn't there, but the father was here now, and the empire was gone, and Richard had never been happier. Some weddings never happen for a reason. Some truths arrive wearing uniforms instead of suits, spoken by people with everything to lose and nothing to gain except the knowledge that they did the right thing. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't building something impressive, it's tearing down what you've built when you realize it's standing on lies. Richard Cole's mother knew something that took her son 30 years to learn, that freedom isn't found in wealth or power or perfect weddings. It's found in truth, in the courage to face painful realities, in the willingness to sacrifice comfort for integrity. Clara Bennett understood this too. She had grown up with nothing, so she knew something that wealthy people often forget, that dignity matters more than dollars, that speaking up, even when your voice shakes, even when there are consequences, is the most powerful thing a person can do. And Daniel Cole, the father who disappeared, who made the hardest choice of his life to protect his son, learned that sometimes love means sacrifice. Sometimes it means letting people hate you if that's what keeps them safe. But he also learned that truth has a way of surfacing, that secrets, no matter how deep you bury them, eventually demand to be heard. So here's the question that matters, the one that should keep you up at night thinking. If you were Richard, standing at that crossroads, knowing that exposing the truth would cost you everything you had worked for, would you do it? Would you sacrifice your empire, your reputation, your safety for the chance to be free? Or would you keep your head down, play the game?
Protect what you have. And if you were Clara, would you speak up at that wedding? Would you risk your job, your safety, your entire life to tell the truth to someone who might not even listen? Would you do it if you knew the cost? Because here's what Richard's story teaches us. The truth is expensive. Your peace, your ability to look at yourself in the mirror and recognize who you see. What would you choose? Security or freedom? Comfort or truth? The empire you built or the person you could become? Let us know in the comments, not just your answer, but why. What would drive your choice? What are you willing to sacrifice? What are you unwilling to lose? Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is standing at their own crossroads. Someone is choosing between speaking up and staying silent, between protecting themselves and protecting the truth. And maybe your story, your reason, your answer will give them the courage they need. That's how change happens, not through one dramatic moment, but through thousands of small choices made by people who decide that truth matters more than comfort. People like Clara, like Richard's mother, like Richard himself. People like you. Share this story. Talk about it. Ask yourself the hard questions, because we all face moments where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And the choices we make in those moments define who we really are. Not our bank accounts, not our titles, not the empires we build, but the courage we show when truth demands to be heard. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories that make you think, that challenge you, that remind you what really matters. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? What part of this story hit you the hardest? We read every comment, and your thoughts matter. See you in the next one.